Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are diving into a really incredible theme drawn from two very different but totally connected stories. We're talking about vulnerability, specifically how it acts as the ultimate catalyst for healing. Now, we usually think of vulnerability as a weakness, right? Like a crack in our armor. But what if I told you it's actually the secret to unlocking real, lasting strength? Not just for us personally, but for our entire communities. In this explainer, we're going to look at what happens when we strip away our defenses, both literally and metaphorically, and how that simple act can invite some truly unimaginable healing. So think about this for a second. What actually happens to our lives when we stop using locks? Just imagine a world, or hey, even just your own neighborhood, where fear doesn't dictate where we draw our boundaries. We're so conditioned to protect ourselves, aren't we? We lock away our valuables, we lock away our hearts. But what if those exact same locks are the things keeping us isolated? Let's jump into a story that answers this question in the most literal way possible. Okay, to really get this, we're taking a trip to the slow, sleepy town of Thavalpur. It's one of those places where mornings just kind of drift in and evenings are spent swapping stories under warm yellow streetlights. And right in the middle of this town, there's this house with light blue walls and absolutely no doors. Seriously, no doors. This is the home of Prabhat Babu and his wife Sharda Devi. Right outside, they've hung a handwritten board that says, "No locks are used here because there is no fear here." It's literally an architecture built entirely on trust. Now, you might be wondering, who actually lives like this? Well, Prabhat Babu inherited this completely radical worldview from his father, who was a freedom fighter. His dad believed that if you have the courage to fight for your country, you shouldn't need to cower behind a locked door out of fear. He lived by this incredibly powerful philosophy. Locks don't stop thieves, they just scare us. And when a man begins to fear, trust dies. So for Prabhat, living without locks, it wasn't some foolish stunt. It was an active, daily choice to just completely reject fear. But of course, a philosophy like that is definitely going to get tested. And it did. On a totally normal night, around 8 p.m., the doorway was left wide open, just like always. Fast forward to about 2 a.m., and a desperate, exhausted young thief named Arjun sneaks into the house. He grabs a few things, a brass pot, some savings, a couple of saris. But here's the wild part. When Prabhat and Sharda woke up at 7 a.m., they didn't just notice their stuff was gone. They found something else left right on the stairs, a confession note. This moment is just absolutely brilliant, and it perfectly captures the sheer power of an open door. The thief's note actually read, "I am a thief, but this was the first house where I couldn't break the door because it was already open." He literally admitted that while he took their physical belongings, he ended up leaving behind his own guilt. That radical, unshakable trust of an unlocked house just completely paralyzed his instinct to steal with any kind of pride. Instead, it birthed this immense transformative guilt right inside him. And that one singular act of forgiveness, it set off a massive ripple effect. Literally within a week, a completely drenched and shivering Arjun showed back up to apologize. And Prabhat Babu, he just welcomed him right in, no questions asked. Fast forward a month, and Arjun completely turns his life around, taking on the new name Prakash, which actually means light. A year later, Prakash opens what they called the Vishwas Kach, a room of trust, basically a safe space for neighborhood kids to read and play freely. And by year 5, the entire village had radically transformed. The whole thing inspired this beautiful new tradition in the village called Akiri Tala, or the last lock. It became a custom for village newlyweds to literally throw away their physical locks after getting married, and they would plant a tree of trust instead. Think about that. Physical vulnerability, the actual removal of metal locks, became their collective, unshakable strength as a community. And what's absolutely crucial here is that this radical trust actually began to scale. It spread like wildfire. Another thief, a guy named Haricharan, left his own note, was welcomed in, and totally reformed to become a village teacher. Then the village opened a kitchen of trust where anyone could take or leave food. No locks, no caretaker, just total trust. Eventually, a journalist named Anvita Mishra caught wind of this and wrote about the village, which inspired people all the way out in the city to start creating their own public corners of trust. The whole shebang started with just one unlocked door. Now let's switch gears for a second. While physical locks are driven by the fear of thieves keeping a house totally isolated, emotional locks are driven by the fear of pain, which isolates a heart. Just like Haricharan brought his open-door philosophy to the busy, locked-up city, we have to recognize something really important. The heaviest, most difficult locks we deal with aren't the ones on our front doors, they're the invisible ones we put up in our relationships. And that brings us to our second story, the story of Savitri Devi. For 7 long years, Savitri Devi has endured this incredibly painful silence with her estranged son, Narendra. She spends her days knitting this blue sweater. And it's not just a hobby. Every single stitch, every knot of wool she ties is a physical manifestation of her unspoken grief. It represents that massive emotional wall standing between her and her son. For Savitri, knitting became her silent language of love and of sorrow. So how did this emotional lock get there? Well, it was forged by words. 7 years ago, during a really heated argument about college fees, her son Narendra stormed off, leaving her with these words, "Mother, you don't need to interfere in everything. I am not a child anymore." Ouch, right? Those words built a massive emotional wall. It caused Savitri to just completely shut down. She stopped communicating, she stopped knitting for years, just completely trapped in her own fear of pushing him even further away. But as we've seen, healing requires an open door. Just like that thief's confession letter in Thavalpur, Savitri was holding on to her own hidden truth. Tucked away inside an old biscuit tin was a letter she had never sent. It said, "Mother doesn't love walls. She looks for a door. Will you ever return?" Deep down, despite all the hurt and all those years of silence, she deeply, deeply wanted to extend an emotional open door. She just needed the courage to finally unlock it. So here's how that crazy 7-year gap finally got bridged. Savitri mustered up all her courage, finished knitting that blue sweater, and finally dropped that unsent letter in the mail. Miles and miles away, sitting in a bustling Mumbai office, Narendra opened it. He read those words, was completely overcome with emotion, and basically dropped everything to return home right away. One single, vulnerable act of reaching out shattered a 7-year silence. But wait, we really need to pause here and ask the tough question. Why was this mother so afraid to let her son go in the first place? Why did she feel the need to interfere so much that it ultimately drove him away? You know, in stories of family conflict, there's almost always a hidden layer of trauma sitting right underneath that controlling behavior. There was a very real reason why Savitri Devi had built such heavy, ironclad emotional locks around her son. The answer actually lies in unraveling the past, and it involves a really heartbreaking secret, a yellow sweater. When Narendra returns, he eventually stumbles upon this hidden silk pouch. Inside, he finds a tiny yellow sweater and a photograph of twin boys. That's when the truth hits him. He had a twin brother named Nikhil, who tragically passed away from a childhood fever because they couldn't get medicine in time. Suddenly, it all makes sense. Savitri's suffocating fear and her controlling nature, it all stemmed from the unresolved trauma of losing her other child. Understanding that truth just changed absolutely everything. The moment Narendra realized what his mother had been carrying all those years, his anger completely dissolved into empathy. To help her heal, he actually picked up the knitting needles himself and started knitting a yellow sweater for his late brother, finishing what she couldn't. And together, this mother and son took all that pain and turned it into purpose. They started a village class called Gant Rishtonki Bunai, which translates to knots weaving relationships. And from that, the beautiful concept of gaunt, meaning knots of wool, was born. The physical act of knitting became this incredible safe space for women in the village to sit together, untangle their own painful memories, share their grief, and actually start healing. What began as Savitri Devi's deeply personal, isolated way of managing her silent trauma evolved into this amazing communal therapy for broken relationships. So, bringing our two narratives together, we see this incredible parallel. A house without doors requires radical trust in the outside world, in absolute strangers. But a heart without knots, that requires radical vulnerability inwardly, with the people we love the most. Both of these stories brilliantly show us that true courage isn't about building thicker walls or stronger defenses. It's about the profound bravery it takes to just leave the door wide open, physically and emotionally. The biggest takeaway here for all of us is the absolute importance of opening our inner doors. Whether it's a thief testing the limits of a community's trust or a son realizing the hidden grief behind his mother's actions, actively unlocking our lives is the only real way to let the light back in. Vulnerability is a total game changer. It's what transforms a hardened criminal into a teacher, and it's what turns a bitter 7-year silence into a movement of communal healing. Ultimately, it all boils down to this one core philosophy. Trust doesn't break before it is lost. It breaks when we stop believing. This perfectly ties together the radical, outward bravery of Prabhat Babu with the quiet, inward emotional resilience of Savitri Devi. The exact moment we stop believing in the possibility of return, the very second we put that lock on the door or tie that tight knot in our heart, that is when trust truly dies. So, as we wrap up, I want to leave you with this thought. Your physical doors might have locks to protect your home, sure, but is your heart open to those who wish to return? Whether it's a complete stranger seeking a second chance or a loved one just hoping to finally bridge a long silence, the choice to remain open is entirely yours. Keep those inner doors unlocked, folks. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today, and I'll catch you next time.